Kyle Benson considered himself a simple man. He liked his coffee black, his shirts ironed, and his routine predictable. There was something satisfying about knowing exactly how your day would unfold. Wake up, shower, breakfast, work, dinner, maybe a game on TV, then bed. Nothing fancy, nothing dramatic. Stability, that was the word. He built his life on it. And yet, on that Tuesday afternoon, standing in his own garage with a half-empty can of WD-40 in one hand and a sinking feeling in his stomach, Kyle had the unmistakable realization that stability had just packed its bags and left the building. It all started with a squeaky door hinge. That was it. A perfectly normal, innocent household annoyance. The kind of thing a man handles without a second thought. So Kyle had grabbed the can of WD-40 from the garage, intending to silence the noise that had been bothering him for weeks. But as he stepped inside, something caught his eye. Something out of place. Joan's golf clubs. They were standing in the corner, covered in a fine layer of dust. That was odd. Not because Joan was some kind of passionate golfer, she wasn't. She had taken up the sport a year ago, inspired by a coworker who convinced her it was a great way to get some fresh air and relieve stress. She had gone all in, bought herself a nice set of clubs, even dragged Kyle to the driving range once. He had spent an entire afternoon watching her swing at the air like she was fighting off invisible enemies. Then, just as suddenly as the hobby had appeared, it had vanished. A few months ago, Joan had claimed she was getting back into it. Every Saturday morning, she had said, me and the girls. It's our thing now. Kyle hadn't thought much of it. He was happy she had something to do. And yet, here were her clubs, standing right where they had been for months, looking about as used as the treadmill in their basement. Kyle stared at them. Joan had left that morning, as she always did on Saturdays, dressed in what she called her golf outfit. The visor, the little polo shirt, the whole thing. She had kissed him on the cheek, grabbed her keys, and walked out the door, just like she always did. Except apparently, she hadn't taken her clubs. Now, Kyle wasn't the type to jump to conclusions. Maybe she had borrowed someone else's set. Maybe she had already left them in the car the night before. Or maybe, just maybe, something wasn't adding up. And that's when the real problem began. See, Kyle had one fatal flaw: he was an overthinker. It wasn't paranoia, per se. He just had a bad habit of following thoughts down a rabbit hole until he either found an answer or convinced himself he was losing his mind. And standing there in his garage, staring at those golf clubs, he could already feel the spiral beginning. So, what did he do? He did what any reasonable, mature husband would do. He grabbed his phone, pulled up Joan's location sharing app, and checked where she was. Not at the golf course. Now, Kyle wasn't some naive guy. He knew people turned off their locations sometimes. Privacy, battery life, whatever. But Joan? Joan was the kind of person who checked her own location just to make sure she hadn't wandered off somewhere by accident. The fact that it was off now? That was interesting. Still, no need to panic. Maybe her phone had died. Maybe she was actually golfing, and for some reason, the clubs in the garage were just an illusion. Maybe he was overthinking again. But that sinking feeling in his stomach told him otherwise. Kyle walked back into the house, setting the WD-40 on the counter. He felt ridiculous. This was exactly the kind of thing Joan would roll her eyes at. You and your detective brain, she'd say. Not everything is a mystery, Kyle. Except this one kind of was. He sat down at the kitchen table, drumming his fingers against the wood. He wasn't the jealous type. Not really. He and Joan had been married for 7 years, together for 10. They were solid. Sure, things had gotten a little stale. Marriage had a way of turning grand romantic gestures into grocery store debates over which brand of peanut butter to buy, but that was normal. But now? Now there were questions. Where was Joan, if not at the golf course? Why had she told him she was going? Why was her location off? And why, of all things, did it have to be golf? If she was going to be sneaky, at least pick a hobby he wasn't actively bad at. Kyle leaned back in his chair, exhaling. There was only one way to find out. He grabbed his keys and headed for the door. Kyle wasn't an impulsive man. He was the kind of guy who read product reviews before buying a toaster, who checked the weather app before stepping outside, who never sent an email without proofreading it twice. His entire life was built on careful decision-making, yet here he was, walking out the front door with no plan, fueled by nothing but curiosity and a growing suspicion that his wife had developed an interesting new definition of golfing. First stop, the golf course. Not because he expected to find Joan there, but because if he didn't check, there was a slim chance he'd be forced to sit through a long-winded speech later about trust, communication, and how he was letting his imagination run wild. So, for the sake of covering his bases, he drove over, pulled into the parking lot, and sat there for a moment, watching. A few retirees waddled toward the clubhouse. A dad struggled to convince his kid to hold a golf club the right way. Two guys in polo shirts high-fived like they had just saved the world. Normal golf course things. No Joan. Kyle checked the time. 2 hours since she left. He rubbed his jaw. Could be anywhere by now. Or, more accurately, could be wherever she had been going in the first place. Alright, next logical step, think like Joan. Where would she go? What did she like? Kyle ran through the list. Joan wasn't the type to spend hours at a spa. She wasn't secretly attending pottery classes or taking up knitting. And unless she had suddenly developed a deep appreciation for warehouse shopping, she wasn't spending all this time at Costco. Kyle pulled out his phone. If she wasn't at the golf course, that meant she had been lying. If she had been lying, that meant she had a reason. If she had a reason, well, that was the problem, wasn't it? He didn't know the reason. There was only one person who might. Kyle tapped on a name in his contacts and hit call. Yeah? Hey, Lisa, Kyle said, keeping his voice casual. Quick question for you. Joan said she was golfing today. You guys together? A pause. Oh, not today, Lisa said, her tone shifting slightly. Kyle narrowed his eyes. Huh. That's weird. She said it was a regular thing. Every Saturday, right? Another pause. Yeah, usually, Lisa said. But, I think she mentioned taking a break for a bit? A break. That was an interesting way to phrase it. Kyle drummed his fingers against the steering wheel. You don't sound sure. Lisa laughed, but it was the nervous kind. I mean, I don't keep track of everyone's schedule, you know? Translation, I know something, and I'm trying really hard not to say it. Got it, Kyle said. Well, thanks anyway. He hung up before she could find another excuse. Okay. That was enough playing detective. Time to get some real answers. If Joan wasn't golfing, and her friends were acting like they'd been sworn to secrecy, then the only way to figure out where she went was to go straight to the source. Kyle turned the car around and headed home. He didn't have to wait long. 2 hours later, Joan walked in, carrying nothing. No golf bag, no visor, not even the smug satisfaction of someone who had just spent a productive day swinging at tiny white balls. Hey, she said, setting her keys down. How was your day? Kyle leaned against the counter. Not bad. You? Good, Joan said, pulling off her sneakers. Nice to get some fresh air. Yeah. Kyle nodded. Golf was good? There it was. The briefest flicker of hesitation, the kind you wouldn't catch unless you were looking for it. Yep, she said, with the confidence of someone who had just been handed a pop quiz. Really great. Kyle stared at her. She didn't flinch. So, he said, who won? Joan blinked. She said, we weren't really keeping score. Kyle tilted his head. You weren't keeping score? Joan laughed, waving him off. Come on, you know how it is. We just played for fun. Right, Kyle said. And what hole did you start on? Another flicker. Kyle folded his arms. See, that's interesting, he said. Because I went to the golf course today. Joan's smile froze. Kyle shrugged. Didn't see you there. Didn't see your car. Didn't see anyone looking like they were just playing for fun. Joan's fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. You went to the golf course, she repeated. Yep, Kyle said. Because I'm a fool who totally believes you when you say you're going somewhere and then forget to bring the thing you need to do the thing. Joan's mouth opened, then closed. Kyle sighed. Look, I don't need some elaborate excuse. I just want to hear the truth. Joan hesitated. And then, finally, she exhaled. Fine, she said. I wasn't golfing. Kyle raised an eyebrow. No kidding. Joan rubbed her forehead. I just needed some space. Kyle stared at her. Space, he repeated. Yes, Kyle, space, Joan snapped. Can I not have that? Does everything have to be some big deal? Kyle held up his hands. Not saying it's a big deal. Just saying that lying about it makes it seem like a big deal. Joan rolled her eyes. You're blowing this out of proportion. Okay, Kyle said. So tell me. Where were you? Joan hesitated again, just for a second too long. Just out, she said. Right, Kyle said. You took the car, left the house, didn't go to golf, didn't tell your friends, and just went out. Joan crossed her arms. Yes. Kyle let out a slow breath. You realize how shady that sounds, right? Joan threw up her hands. What do you want me to say, Kyle? That I sat in a parking lot for 2 hours just to get away from you? Kyle squinted. Did you? Maybe I did. Joan snapped. Maybe I just needed time. Maybe I wanted to sit in my car and think for a while. Is that a crime now? Kyle studied her. Joan was many things, but she was not a sit in the car and think for 2 hours kind of person. So, he said, you're telling me you left the house, sat alone in a parking lot for 2 hours, then came back? Yes, Joan said. Kyle nodded. Great, he said. Which parking lot? Joan opened her mouth, then immediately closed it. Kyle smiled. Take your time, he said. I'll wait. Joan wasn't answering. Kyle leaned against the counter, arms crossed, waiting. He had time. Plenty of time. More time than Joan apparently needed to come up with a parking lot location that wasn't imaginary. I don't see why this matters, Joan finally said. Kyle raised an eyebrow. You don't see why it matters where you were for 2 hours when you told me you were somewhere else entirely? Joan exhaled sharply, like she was being interrogated for a bank heist. Kyle, seriously? You're acting like I committed a crime. Kyle gave her a look. If you're innocent, then why do you look like you're about to plead the fifth? Joan groaned, rubbing her temples. You know what? I don't need this. I don't have to explain every second of my day to you. Kyle nodded. Sure. But you do have to explain why you're lying. I'm not lying, Joan said. Right. Just forgetting key details, Kyle said. Like where you were, who you were with, and why your golf clubs are currently in the garage collecting dust instead of getting the rigorous workout you supposedly gave them today. Joan opened her mouth, then closed it again. Kyle gave her another second, just in case she miraculously remembered which imaginary parking lot she had been so emotionally attached to for 2 hours. Nothing. Okay, Kyle said. Let's make it easier. Were you alone? Joan's face twitched. Not a lot, but enough. Enough for Kyle to see it. That's a weird question, Joan said. Kyle let out a short laugh. It's actually a really simple one. Yes or no? Joan grabbed a glass from the cupboard and filled it with water. She took a long sip, which Kyle noted was an impressive delay tactic. Unfortunately, it didn't change the fact that he was still standing there, still waiting. Joan set the glass down a little too hard. I don't like this, Kyle. Kyle nodded. I'm not a huge fan of it either, believe it or not. You're treating me like a suspect in some ridiculous investigation, Joan snapped. Kyle tilted his head. And you're treating me like I'm fool enough to believe whatever vague nonsense you're trying to sell me. Joan let out a sharp breath. Fine. I wasn't alone. Happy? Kyle smirked. Not even a little. Who were you with? Joan folded her arms. A friend. Kyle nodded slowly. Ah. A friend. Yes. A friend who plays golf? Joan hesitated. Not really. Kyle took a deep breath. Joan, I swear, if you make me drag this out question by question, I'm going to start charging you for my time. Joan looked like she was seriously considering whether she could just throw the water in his face and walk away. Then, finally, she sighed. It was just someone I know, Joan said. Kyle squinted. You realize someone I know is just a fancier way of saying, I don't want to tell you who it was, right? Joan ran a hand through her hair. I don't know why you're making this such a big deal. Kyle nodded. Right, because married people often make mysterious plans with someone they know and then lie about it afterward. Totally normal. Joan's jaw tightened. It's not what you think. Kyle leaned forward slightly. Oh, cool. What do I think? Joan hesitated. Kyle grinned. That's what I thought. Joan threw up her hands. You know what? Believe whatever you want. I don't owe you a detailed itinerary of my life. Kyle blinked. You're my wife. And? Kyle let out a short laugh. And you're seriously trying to argue that disappearing for hours and lying about it is just, what, your personal business? That's the stance you're taking? Joan crossed her arms again. I don't have to defend myself just because you suddenly decided to play detective. Kyle nodded. Great. So when do I get to start lying to you about where I go? Do I get a free pass too, or is this one of those Joan-only privileges? Joan blared. That's not the same thing. Oh, isn't it? Kyle asked. So, let me get this straight. If I left the house every Saturday, told you I was going to, I don't know, let's say axe throwing class, but never actually went, and instead, I was meeting up with someone I know in some secret location, you'd be totally cool with that? Joan's mouth opened, then closed. Kyle shrugged. I'll sign up right now, if that's the case. Always wanted to throw axes. Joan groaned. Kyle, I just wanted to talk to someone, okay? I needed a different perspective. Kyle's expression didn't change. And that perspective had to come from someone you know who you can't seem to name? Joan ran a hand over her face. I was with Greg, all right? Kyle blinked. Joan folded her arms. There. Happy now? Kyle blinked again. Greg, he repeated. Yes. The same Greg I work with? Joan hesitated. Yes. Kyle stared at her. Joan stared back. Kyle let out a short, humorless laugh. You've got to be kidding me. Joan exhaled. Kyle, it's not. Oh, no, please, Kyle said, holding up a hand. By all means. Tell me why my coworker, Greg, was the only person in the world qualified to give you this mysterious perspective that you just couldn't discuss with your actual husband. Joan clenched her jaw. Because it's about you. Kyle's smile didn't reach his eyes. Oh, fantastic. So you're meeting up with Greg to discuss me. That's not weird at all. Joan rolled her eyes. You're twisting this into something it's not. Kyle let out another laugh. Oh, trust me, I'd love to be wrong. I'd love for this to be a hilarious misunderstanding. But somehow, I'm guessing it's not. Joan shook her head. It's just talking, Kyle. Kyle nodded. Aha. Talking. With Greg. Yes. Kyle sighed. Joan, I swear, if you tell me you just needed someone to listen, I'm going to go find the nearest wall and walk into it repeatedly. Joan groaned. It's not like that. Kyle tilted his head. Then what's it like? Joan didn't answer. Kyle smiled. Go on. Take your time. Kyle had a lot of thoughts. Some of them were normal, like why is my wife secretly meeting up with Greg? Others were less normal, like is there a legal way to get Greg transferred to Antarctica? Joan, standing across from him, arms crossed like she was the one being interrogated by the FBI, was not giving him anything useful. She just kept repeating that it was just talking like that meant something. Kyle rubbed his temple. So? Let's go over this one more time, just for fun. You told me you were playing golf. You weren't. You told your friends you were taking a break from golf, which you conveniently never mentioned to me. You turned off your location. And instead of doing literally anything else, you spent 2 hours talking to Greg. About me. Joan's face tightened. I needed advice. Kyle laughed. Not the kind of laugh that comes from joy, the kind that happens when your brain short-circuits from sheer absurdity. You needed advice. From Greg. Joan exhaled. Kyle, don't do this. Oh, I'm already doing it, Kyle said. Greg. The guy I work with. The guy who once told me he keeps a spreadsheet of every time his wife forgets to say thank you so he can bring it up later. That's the Greg you went to for marriage advice? Joan's eye twitched. Kyle pointed at her. See? Even you know it sounds stupid. Joan let out a sharp breath. He understands what I'm going through, okay? Kyle's stomach did something unpleasant. What exactly are you going through that Greg understands? Joan looked away. It's complicated. Kyle clapped his hands together. Oh, fantastic. Love when things are complicated. Joan clenched her jaw. Kyle, No, it's fine, Kyle said. It's totally fine. I mean, who am I to judge? Greg's obviously an expert. I'm sure he's got tons of experience keeping marriages intact. Oh, wait, he doesn't. Because Greg is divorced. Joan looked back at him. Kyle grinned. That's right, Greg, who is somehow the only person you could talk to, is divorced. You know who isn't divorced? Me. You know who also isn't divorced? Literally any of your friends. But no, Greg is the guy you had to see in secret. Joan stayed silent. Kyle's stomach twisted again. He wasn't a stupid. He knew what this looked like. Are you sleeping with him? Kyle asked. Joan's head snapped up. No. Kyle watched her carefully. He had spent years reading Joan's expressions, knowing when she was lying about finishing the last of the ice cream or pretending she forgot to pay the electric bill on time. She wasn't lying. Okay. So, not yet. Kyle took a deep breath. All right. You're not. Good to know. Joan looked at him warily. So that's it? Kyle shook his head. Not even close. And just like that, something in Kyle's brain clicked into place. Greg was a problem. But Greg wasn't the problem. The real issue was Joan. Joan, who had apparently decided that honesty was optional, that lying was acceptable as long as she thought Kyle wouldn't notice. That was the part Kyle couldn't let go. So, he did what any rational, emotionally stable man would do in this situation. He smiled. A real, full, calm smile. Joan frowned immediately. What? Kyle shook his head. Nothing. Just realizing a few things. Joan narrowed her eyes. Like what? Kyle shrugged. Like how I need to start taking advice from Greg, too. Joan looked genuinely alarmed. Kyle. Kyle held up a hand. No, you're right. Greg is clearly a relationship guru. I mean, look how well he handled his own marriage. Joan let out an exasperated noise. You're being ridiculous. Oh, no, you're the one sneaking around and lying to my face. I'm the ridiculous one, Kyle said. Right. Got it. Joan pinched the bridge of her nose. What do you want, Kyle? Kyle took a step forward. I want you to wonder what I'm going to do next. Joan's hand dropped. Excuse me? Kyle smiled again. That's fair, I wondered what you were doing today, so now we're even. Joan's eyes narrowed. Kyle, what are you? But Kyle was already walking past her. Joan turned. Where are you going? Kyle grabbed his keys. Oh, I don't know. Maybe to talk to someone I know. Joan's face darkened. Kyle, stop. Kyle whistled as he headed for the door. You are not going to act like I did something wrong, Joan snapped. Kyle turned, still grinning. Oh, I'm not? Joan's hands curled into fists. You're acting childish. Kyle nodded. Oh, definitely. Lying to my face was the mature move. You set a great example. Joan inhaled sharply. Kyle, seriously. But Kyle had already opened the door. See you later, Joan, he called. Or maybe I won't. Hard to say. Sometimes people just go places without telling the truth about where they are. And then, for the first time in his life, Kyle slammed the door on purpose. Joan called him 3 times in the next hour. Kyle didn't pick up. Instead, he parked at a gas station, leaned back in his seat, and thought. This wasn't about revenge. Not really. It wasn't even about Greg. It was about control. Joan had spent who knows how long lying, making decisions on her own, assuming Kyle would just go along with it. Fine. 2 could play that game. Kyle opened his phone and started typing. Step 1, find out how long Joan had been lying. Step 2, make her regret it. Step 3? Make sure Greg never wants to set foot in the same building as him again. Kyle had never been the kind of guy to make a scene. He wasn't the type to yell, throw things, or stomp around like some cartoon villain. That wasn't his style. But the one thing he did have? Patience. Patience was a skill. Most people didn't have it, which is why they got caught up in fool mistakes, bad poker plays, impulse purchases, saying something they'd regret 5 seconds later. But Kyle? Kyle knew how to wait. And right now, he was waiting to see just how far Joan would go to dig herself out of the hole she had created. She had already tried calling him. 3 times. Then came the texts. Joan, Kyle, come home. We need to talk. Joan, I don't want to fight. Joan, please. Kyle read each message as they came in, then locked his phone and kept scrolling through his notes. How long had this been going on? If she had been lying about where she was, then she was probably lying about when it started too. Another text popped up. Joan, I'm sorry. Kyle almost laughed. That was fast. She had moved to the apology stage without even bothering to clarify what, exactly, she was sorry for. That was always a fun tactic. If you apologize vaguely enough, maybe the other person will just fill in the blanks with something they can forgive. Kyle wasn't going to do that. 5 minutes later, his phone rang again. This time, he answered. Are you done texting me yet? He asked. Joan let out a breath. Kyle, can you just? Kyle hung up. A second later, another text. Joan, did you just hang up on me? Kyle snorted. Yes, Joan, I did. Good observational skills. Another call. He let it ring 3 times before answering. Having fun yet? Kyle said. Joan exhaled sharply. Kyle, can you please come home? Kyle leaned back in his seat. Why? Joan hesitated. Because we need to talk. Kyle nodded. Right. And when I wanted to talk earlier, what did you do? Joan groaned. Kyle, come on. Be serious. Oh, I'm very serious, Kyle said. I just don't see why I have to be the one to come home when you are the one who screwed up. Another silence. Then Joan sighed. Fine. Where are you? Kyle grinned. Wouldn't you like to know? Joan muttered something under her breath. Probably something unkind. Kyle took that as a victory. Kyle, Joan said, I swear, if you don't come home. You'll do what? Kyle interrupted. Lie to me again? Disappear for another couple hours? Call Greg? Joan didn't respond. Kyle waited. Still nothing. Joan? Kyle said, his voice mockingly polite. You still there? Or are you taking a moment to come up with another excuse? Joan inhaled sharply. I didn't do anything wrong. Kyle smiled. Oh, fantastic. So we're going with that now. Joan's voice became more desperate. Kyle, I just needed someone to talk to. That's all it was. I didn't cheat. I didn't do anything to hurt you. I was just lost. Kyle rolled his eyes. Ah, there it is. The classic I was lost defense. So mysterious. So tragic. So completely unhelpful. Lost, Kyle repeated. Lost, but somehow Greg was the human GPS you needed? Joan's voice cracked. Kyle, I swear, you're making this into something it's not. Kyle nodded. Right. Because you have been such a reliable narrator so far. Another silence. Then, Joan changed tactics. Her voice softened. Kyle. I don't want to lose you. Kyle smirked. There it is. The shift. The pity stage. He could practically hear her eyes filling with tears. Joan had always been good at this. Anytime things got too heated, she'd lower her voice, get all vulnerable, and suddenly she was the one who needed comfort. It was very effective. Just not today. Kyle stayed quiet. Kyle, Joan whispered, please. I love you. Kyle looked at his reflection in the car window. He didn't look angry. He didn't even look sad. He just looked done. Do you? Kyle asked. Joan's breath hitched. Of course I do. Kyle exhaled slowly. Then why did you lie? Joan swallowed. Because she stopped. Kyle waited. She didn't continue. Kyle shook his head. Yeah. That's what I thought. Kyle, please, Joan's voice cracked again. Come home. We can fix this. I don't want to fight anymore. I just want us. Kyle closed his eyes. Wow. She was really throwing everything at the wall, hoping something would stick. He could almost hear her brain scrambling for what he wanted to hear. That's what this was now. A performance. Kyle opened his eyes. You sound really emotional right now, Joan. Joan sniffled. Because I love you. Kyle smiled. No, because you got caught. Silence. Kyle let it hang there for a second. Then he continued, his voice steady. You didn't feel bad when you lied to my face. You didn't feel bad when you turned off your location. You didn't feel bad when you spent who knows how long secretly meeting up with Greg. But now that I know? Now you're sorry. Joan let out a shaky breath. That's not fair. Kyle's smile widened. Oh, I am being unfair? Me? Joan's voice wavered. Kyle, please. Kyle nodded. No, I get it. It's so unfair of me to be upset that my wife has been sneaking around and lying. How dare I have emotions about that? Joan started crying. Full crying. Kyle didn't care. She could cry all she wanted. He wasn't bending. Not this time. I'll come home when I'm ready, Kyle said. Until then, enjoy your free time. You seem to have a lot of it." Then he hung up. And for the first time in a long time, Kyle felt like he was in control. Kyle didn't go home that night. Not because he was trying to be dramatic. Not because he wanted Joan to panic. Just because he wasn't in the mood to look at her. Instead, he drove to his buddy Matt's house and let himself in without knocking, because that's the kind of friendship they had. Matt, who was halfway through a plate of takeout, looked up from the couch. "You look like you're either getting a divorce or starting a new religion." Kyle dropped onto the chair across from him. "Joan's been sneaking around with Greg." Matt stopped mid-chew. "Greg? From your office?" Kyle nodded. Matt swallowed. "Wow." He set his fork down. "I mean, I always knew she had questionable taste. She married you, but Greg? That's rough." Kyle snorted. "Right?" Matt leaned back. "All right, what's the plan?" Kyle stared at the ceiling. "Well, first I ignored her calls. Then I let her cry at me over the phone. And now, I'm sitting here, debating whether or not to go home." Matt nodded. "You should not go home." Kyle sighed. "I mean, eventually." Matt shrugged. "Sure. Eventually. But make her wonder first." Kyle smirked. "That's what I was thinking." Matt pointed at him. "See, this is why we're friends." Kyle spent the night on Matt's couch, ignoring the increasingly desperate texts from Joan. He slept well. The next morning, Kyle finally went home. Joan was waiting in the kitchen like a contestant on a game show about to hear if she won or lost everything. Kyle set his keys down. "Morning." Joan's eyes were puffy. "Where were you?" Kyle grabbed a coffee mug. "Out." Joan swallowed. "Kyle, please." Kyle turned. "Look. I've already decided what I'm going to do, so you don't have to keep begging." Joan's breath hitched. "You have?" Kyle took a sip of his coffee. "Yeah. I'm done." Joan went pale. "What?" Kyle leaned against the counter. "I don't trust you anymore. And I don't want to be married to someone I don't trust." Joan took a shaky step forward. "Kyle, I swear, it wasn't like that." "I didn't." Kyle cut her off. "I don't care what it was like. I care that you lied to me over and over and only started apologizing when you realized you were caught." Joan shook her head. "I was scared." Kyle laughed. "Oh, you were scared? I must have missed the terrifying part of hanging out with Greg in secret." Joan's voice cracked. "I didn't mean to hurt you." Kyle exhaled. "Joan. You made a choice. Multiple choices. And now, I'm making one too." Tears welled in Joan's eyes. "So that's it?" Kyle nodded. "That's it." Joan started crying again, but Kyle just watched, unmoved. She wasn't crying because she lost him. She was crying because she lost control. He set his mug down, grabbed his keys, and headed for the door. Joan's voice trembled behind him. "Where are you going?" Kyle smiled to himself as he walked out. "Somewhere I don't have to deal with this anymore." Thanks for watching. Please hit the like button and rate the story in the comments.